The grand diplomatic reception of the United Council of Civilized Planets was supposed to be a strictly regulated affair. Every handshake, every bow, every piece of attire had been codified in a 17-volume treaty that required a legal degree just to interpret. Naturally, humanity had read all 17 volumes, found 39 loopholes, and was now exploiting them with the kind of casual indifference that made intergalactic dignitaries break out in cold sweats. Ambassador Gregory Hill of Earth stood at the center of the grand hall, smiling warmly. His suit was impeccable, his tie precisely knotted, and, most horrifying of all, his pocket square was folded in a way that had never before been documented in the Galactic Etiquette Codex. Blorg, the Zypher Trade representative, had spent the last 17 minutes pulsating in distress. "This is a diplomatic insult of the highest order," Blorg finally exploded, his chromatophores flashing a deep shade of indignant mauve. Gregory blinked, looking down at his pocket square. "Oh, this? It's the Eldridge knot fold. Very elegant, don't you think?" Blorg's tendrils twitched. "There is no record of this Eldridge knot fold in the official guidelines." "Well, there was nothing in the treaty prohibiting new folds," Gregory said, taking a sip of his tea. "But if it's a problem, we'd be happy to file a formal request for an addendum." A horrified murmur swept through the room. A formal addendum required the involvement of the Bureau of Treaty Revisions, which had a backlog of precisely 863 years. Blorg was momentarily too stunned to respond. Admiral Krex of the UCCP military, who had already downed 3 glasses of something distressingly alcoholic, slammed his fist on the table. "Forget the pocket square. What about the antimatter weapons?" The human security team, standing casually by the buffet table, glanced up from their conversation about fantasy football. "Oh, these?" One of them patted the antimatter warhead slung over his shoulder. "Standard issue. Like cufflinks." Admiral Krex's mandibles clacked together in pure horror. "You brought enough destructive power to vaporize a star system to a peace summit?" Gregory took another sip of tea. "The treaty never specified disarmament. Just that weapons must be appropriately accessorized to match formal attire. Hence, the tasteful black holsters." A legal aide for the UCCP fainted. Blorg, still reeling from the pocket square debacle, sputtered, You knew the rules this well? But you've only been in the galactic community for 3 years." Gregory smiled. "Oh, we studied them thoroughly. You know how humans love a good user manual." The Zypher Trade representative made a sound that could only be described as existentially defeated gurgling. Just then, Sandra Wu, the Human Trade Commissioner, breezed into the room holding a tablet. "Ah, perfect timing," she said cheerfully. "Before we continue, I wanted to bring up a minor issue regarding interest rates." 3 regulatory AI systems in the room overheated and shut down immediately. Sandra, as always, looked completely unbothered. "It seems that, due to a minor clerical error, the UCCP currently owes Earth approximately 600 trillion credits in compounding interest." "Oh, but don't worry! We're willing to restructure the payments over the next 500 years. At a very reasonable rate." Admiral Krex, who had up until this point been internally screaming, now began externally screaming. Blorg, whose chromatophores had gone entirely gray with existential despair, croaked. You people aren't following the rules. You're abusing them." Gregory looked mildly offended. "We are following the rules, Blorg. Exactly as written." There was a moment of silence. Then a quiet, terrified whisper from the back of the room. "They've weaponized bureaucracy." The entire room collectively realized that the humans had not just integrated into the galactic community. They had already taken control of it. 2 weeks had passed since the Pocket Square affair, and the United Council of Civilized Planets was still recovering. Diplomatic aides had been hospitalized for stress-related illnesses. The Bureau of Treaty Revisions had called for an emergency summit just to determine whether newly invented fashion folds constituted a security risk. But worst of all, the humans were acting like nothing had happened. Sandra Wu sat comfortably in the Grand Conference Hall, sipping coffee as an emergency session was called to address the Growing procedural crisis posed by humanity's unorthodox yet technically legal behavior. The UCCP had compiled a lengthy document detailing humanity's recent infractions, 17 protocol violations, 33 trade infractions, and for reasons no one could quite explain, one instance of humans teaching a hive mind how to play poker. Blorg, his chromatophores still dull from stress, took the floor. Esteemed delegates, he began, voice warbling slightly. We must act swiftly. The humans have made a mockery of our treaties. Our laws are built on a foundation of order, and yet, in the short time since their admission to the UCCP, they have systematically unraveled that order through. He flailed his tentacles helplessly, searching for words. Malicious compliance, Admiral Krex muttered, rubbing his temples. Yes. Malicious compliance. Blorg seized on the phrase, though he didn't entirely understand it. They have broken nothing, yet destroyed everything. Sandra raised a hand politely. Excuse me, but could you clarify which specific infractions are being called into question? I'd like to ensure we're operating within the appropriate framework. Blorg's chromatophores flickered with distress. The Pocket Square affair. Sandra smiled. Already submitted a formal addendum request. Standard processing time, 863 years. Admiral Krex twitched. Then the issue of you bringing antimatter to a peace summit. Sandra flipped through her notes. We were fully compliant with all regulations regarding weapon concealment and accessory coordination. The hive mind, someone from the back shouted. You taught them gambling. Sandra sighed dramatically. We merely introduced them to statistical probability theory in a social setting. They're running a quantum casino now. Sandra sipped her coffee. And they're doing quite well. The room devolved into an incoherent shouting match. Finally, the Supreme Counselor of the UCCP, an ancient, dignified being known as SCI, silenced the chamber with a single wave of their many-jointed appendages. Enough, they intoned gravely. We must take decisive action. Admiral Krex straightened. Then you authorize a military response? SCI gave him a look of pure, distilled disappointment. Don't be ridiculous. If we start a war, the humans will no doubt find some loophole that allows them to accidentally annex half the galaxy while claiming self-defense. They turned their many eyes on Sandra Wu. What we need is intelligence. The humans have been hiding their true capabilities from us. We must know what they are truly planning. Blorg hesitated. And how do you suggest we do that? A grim silence filled the chamber. Then, SCI spoke the words that would come to haunt the UCCP for generations to come. We conduct a full inspection of Earth's military facilities. The room went dead quiet. Sandra tilted her head. An inspection? Oh, that's an interesting idea. She tapped a few things on her tablet. According to Section 12, Clause 4 of the Intergalactic Defense Transparency Act, we'd be happy to oblige, so long as this is a reciprocal agreement. Blorg frowned. Reciprocal? Sandra smiled. Well, if you inspect our military facilities, we'll have to inspect yours. Standard parity clause. Admiral Krex visibly paled. The Zephyr Empire's military facilities consisted mostly of large, highly classified installations filled with planet-destroying weaponry that the UCCP very much did not want humans poking around in. SCI hesitated. Perhaps we should begin with a more limited scope. Sandra shrugged. Your call. Thus, the fateful decision was made. A large UCCP fleet would be dispatched to conduct a thorough inspection of suspected human military sites in the Orion Spur. They expected to find hidden weapon caches, war fleets in waiting, perhaps even experimental technology that could explain humanity's unsettling ability to manipulate bureaucracy like a precision-guided missile. What they found instead was significantly worse. When the fleet arrived in orbit over the designated human installation, there was no sign of battlecruisers or war machines. No secret military bunkers. No covert research facilities. Instead, the entire region of space was filled with massive, glowing creatures, beings the size of moons, shifting and shimmering with impossible colors, moving through reality like it was a mere suggestion. The inspection fleet stared in stunned horror as the creatures twirled and spun in synchronized movements, warping space-time around them like an interpretive dance of quantum physics itself. Sandra's voice crackled over the fleet's communication channel. I see you've arrived at one of our wildlife conservation sites. Blorg, watching a whale the size of Jupiter phase halfway into another dimension before reappearing with a little twirl, was losing the last vestiges of his sanity. Wildlife? Sandra sounded amused. Yes. Space whales. Very rare. We've been working on preservation efforts. Admiral Krex, hands shaking, activated his secure military link. This is a cover-up. These creatures, they must be weapons. Sandra chuckled. Oh, Admiral. That's a bit xenophobic, don't you think? They're just minding their own business. The fleet watched as one of the whales casually rolled over, and with an absent-minded flick of its tail, rearranged a cluster of nearby moons into a perfect geometric pattern that was simultaneously a sphere and, according to certain mathematical models, a highly offensive gesture in 11 dimensions. Admiral Krex let out a noise somewhere between a groan and a whimper. Aboard the lead Zypher ship, a group of high-ranking officers huddled together. We need to report this, one of them whispered. The Council must know. The Council won't believe us, another hissed. They already think we're overreacting about the pocket squares. As they bickered, Sandra Wu's voice came back over the comms. Oh, and just a friendly reminder, our space whales don't react well to hostility. Sudden aggressive movements, high-energy weapon charges, stuff like that tends to make them nervous. Blorg turned an alarming shade of sickly green. What happens if they get nervous? As if in answer, one of the whales suddenly let out a deep, resonating hum that echoed across the system. The fabric of space twisted. The Zypher flagship's hull flickered in and out of reality for half a second before snapping back in place. Blorg made a high-pitched wheezing noise. Oh. Sandra, entirely too cheerful, continued. Anyway, take your time with the inspection. We wouldn't want you to miss any details. The inspection fleet, collectively sweating, decided that perhaps they had seen enough. As they hastily compiled their report for the UCCP, the realization settled in. The humans weren't hiding military installations. They had casually domesticated reality-breaking creatures, turned them into a wildlife conservation project, and then invited the galactic community to take a nice, friendly tour of the Nightmare Zoo. And humanity, smiling, polite, sipping their tea, had done it all without breaking a single rule. The emergency session of the United Council of Civilized Planets was called with record-breaking urgency. The inspection fleet had returned from the Orion Spur in a state of unfiltered existential dread. Some of them had refused to speak at all. Others had been found staring into space, whispering about geometries that should not exist. Admiral Krex had spent the entire debriefing locked in his quarters, drinking something strong enough to dissolve steel. Blorg, unfortunately, did not have the luxury of a nervous breakdown. He had been chosen to present the findings to the full council. He did not want to. As he stood at the speaker's podium, he took a deep breath, adjusted his chromatophores to a neutral diplomatic hue, and activated the holoprojector. It displayed a carefully edited version of the footage from the inspection fleet, specifically, the part where one of the space whales absent-mindedly folded spacetime into a non-Euclidean Mobius strip while chasing its own tail. A collective shudder ran through the assembly. We have a problem, Blorg said simply. SCI, who was generally known for their unshakable composure, was gripping the edge of the council table with a force that was causing microfractures in the reinforced material. What are they? Space whales, Blorg croaked. Apparently protected under human wildlife conservation laws. Admiral Krex, looking hollow-eyed and deeply traumatized, finally spoke. Those creatures broke the laws of physics like they were suggestions. Do you understand what that means? He slammed his fist on the table. They don't have military weapons because they don't need them. They have living, dancing, universe-bending nightmares that can erase a planet by accident. A hush fell over the chamber. Blorg, who had been preparing for this moment, took a deep breath. The problem isn't just the whales, he said. It's the humans themselves. HFY narrowed their many eyes. Explain. Blord pulled up another image, a chart that displayed humanity's interactions with galactic bureaucracy over the past 3 years. It was not normal. In the time since they joined the UCCP, Blorg said, gesturing to the display, humans have exploited over 39 legal loopholes. They have rewritten trade agreements in ways that technically benefit us all, yet somehow leave them with disproportionate influence. They have restructured our tax code in a manner that somehow resulted in them being owed money. And worst of all, they are currently running an intergalactic social media network for the space whales. HFY blinked. They what? Blord brought up a live feed. Across the galaxy, creatures of all shapes and sizes were logging on to what was unmistakably a human-designed social platform. It had an alarming number of memes. The primary contributors? The space whales. One of them had just posted a mathematical proof that, according to the scrolling comments, had instantly revolutionized FTL travel for an entire species. Another whale had shared a video of itself doing what appeared to be a quantum pirouette, warping reality in a way that the comments described as mildly dangerous but aesthetically pleasing. HFY's voice was dangerously low. How long has this been happening? Blorg swallowed. We believe the humans have been encouraging it for some time now. A representative from the Quantum Consciousness Network raised one of their neural tendrils. We learned how to quantum entangle coffee beans for instantaneous brewing because of them, they admitted. A murmur of horror swept the room. HFY pinched the bridge of their primary nasal ridge. We must regain control before they destabilize the entire galactic order. Sandra Wu, who had been sitting quietly at the human delegation's table this entire time, finally spoke. That's an interesting proposal, she said, smiling. How do you intend to do that? HFY's glare could have curdled neutron stars. We will conduct a full-scale regulatory audit of all human intergalactic activities. Sandra's smile didn't waver. Oh, wonderful. In accordance with Treaty Section 19, Clause 8, all audit-based investigations must be conducted under the principles of reciprocity. Blorg stiffened. Reciprocity? Sandra nodded. If you audit us, we audit you. We wouldn't want to be accused of non-compliance with intergalactic transparency laws, after all. The Zephyr delegation went completely still. HFY took a slow breath. You would audit us? Oh, absolutely, Sandra said cheerfully. I'm sure there's nothing to worry about. But just to clarify, this would involve a full assessment of economic policies, military expenditures, and any, shall we say, less documented activities. She adjusted her glasses. Standard procedure. A silence fell over the chamber so thick it could have been classified as a planetary atmosphere. Admiral Krex leaned forward, voice low and dangerous. Are you blackmailing the United Council? Sandra looked genuinely offended. Blackmail? Oh, Admiral, I would never. I'm simply reminding you that laws are laws, and as good, upstanding members of the galactic community, I'm sure you would want to follow them to the letter. HFY's exoskeleton audibly creaked. You're doing it again. Sandra sipped her coffee. Doing what? Exploiting technicalities. Sandra feigned innocence. I would never. HFY took another breath, their entire body vibrating with suppressed rage. What do you want? Sandra smiled. Nothing unreasonable. A few minor tariff adjustments on human exports. A slight increase in voting power within the UCCP Trade Commission. Oh, and perhaps, a reconsideration of the space whale's official legal status. Blorg turned a shade of color usually reserved for catastrophic reactor failures. You want them recognized as sentient? Sandra tilted her head. Well, they are sentient. They rearrange moons into obscene mathematical symbols for fun. Sentient. Blorg flailed helplessly. They don't even speak. Sandra raised a finger. Not true. They communicate through interpretive gravitational distortions. We've even translated a few of their phrases. For example, this particular spin and collapse maneuver roughly translates to LOL. Blorg's eye twitched. Oresvier stared at her for a long, long moment. Then, with the weight of inevitability crushing down upon them, they exhaled. Fine. The chamber erupted into chaos. Blorg tried to protest. Admiral Krex was actively having what could only be described as an emotional collapse. But it didn't matter. The humans had won. Again. Because at the end of the day, they hadn't broken a single rule. They had simply followed them to their logical, ridiculous conclusion. And now, the galactic order was theirs to rewrite. The bureaucratic surrender of the United Council of Civilized Planets was, ironically, one of the smoothest governmental transactions in history. The humans had not fired a single shot, made a single overt threat, or violated a single rule. And yet, through sheer mastery of technicalities, loopholes, and the horrifying application of malicious obedience, they had taken control of the galactic order without anyone quite knowing how it had happened. The official vote to recognize space whales as sentient was pushed through in record time, mostly because the alternative involved a full-scale audit of every major UCCP economy, and no one wanted to risk humanity turning a casual review of trade agreements into the financial equivalent of nuclear Armageddon. The moment the measure passed, the space whales celebrated by spontaneously rearranging a cluster of asteroids into the shape of an enormous thumbs up, except in the 11th dimensional rendering. It was also a highly suggestive gesture that got immediately flagged for indecency by the UCCP's Cultural Oversight Committee. Blorg, who had by now resigned himself to living in a state of permanent existential crisis, slumped in his seat. "They've won," he muttered. "We lost without even fighting." Admiral Krex, who had gone well beyond rage and into a state of weary resignation, simply nodded. "They are unlike any species we have ever encountered. They don't conquer with fleets or firepower. They conquer with bureaucracy, with fine print, with overwhelming politeness and a refusal to take no for an answer." He shook his head. "They have weaponized customer service." Oresvier, who was still attempting to maintain some semblance of composure, exhaled slowly. "We must think strategically," they said. "If we cannot defeat them through conventional means, then perhaps we must learn to understand them." Blorg turned to them with all the energy of a being who had stared too deeply into the abyss. "You want to understand the humans? Fine." He gestured wildly at the large view screen, which displayed a live feed of the Galactic Social Network, the one, to the Council's great horror, that was now primarily populated by space whales. The footage on screen was unfathomable. One of the whales had just posted an elaborate mathematical equation that, according to the scrolling comments, suggested a new method of creating infinite energy. Another had released a short, looping video of itself pirouetting through a quantum singularity, captioned, "Felt cute, might delete later." Meanwhile, the Zephyr Military Intelligence Division had been tracking human activity for weeks, attempting to determine whether their actions were the result of a grand master plan or pure chaos. The answer, alarmingly, appeared to be both. One intercepted message chain between human diplomats revealed that they had collectively forgotten about a major intergalactic summit because they had been too busy debating whether or not a space whale should have a verified badge on the Galactic Social Network. A second report from the Zephyr Economic Department showed that human-controlled financial entities were now so deeply entrenched in intergalactic trade that the entire market depended on the whims of Earth's coffee futures. A third report indicated that a jungle planet, previously a technological backwater, had just invented fully functional teleportation thanks to a single offhand comment from a space whale that had posted, "Has anyone tried quantum phase entanglement yet? LOL." Admiral Krex stared at the reports, then at the Council. "We are not dealing with a normal species." Oresvier closed their eyes, processing. "Then what are we dealing with?" Blorg took a deep breath and answered, "Gremlins." A hushed silence. Oresvier's eyes slowly opened. "I beg your pardon?" Blorg gestured wildly at the mess of reports. "They aren't following a plan. They don't have some grand strategy. They're just messing with reality. For fun. They see the universe as a playground, and every time we try to control them, they just find a way to break the rules in a way that technically doesn't break the rules. Krex looked grim. If that's true, then we don't have the power to stop them. Oresvier's expression was unreadable. Then perhaps, they said carefully, we should stop trying. Silence. Blorg's chromatophores flickered with confusion. You mean, surrender? Oresvier shook their head. No. We do what they do. We adapt. Sandra Wu, who had been politely listening the entire time, folded her hands together and smiled. Now that, she said, is the smartest thing I've heard all day. Oresvier's many eyes fixed on her. Are you saying you were waiting for us to come to that conclusion? Sandra took a sip of her ever-present coffee. Oh no. We would have gotten there eventually. But it's always better when people come to the right decision on their own, don't you think? Blorg groaned, muttering something in Zyphorian that roughly translated to I hate how much sense that makes. Oresvier exhaled slowly. So what now? Sandra leaned back, looking completely at ease. Well, now that the space whales are officially recognized as sentient, we'll be opening negotiations for their representation in the UCCP. There's also the matter of trade negotiations. We're still ironing out the last details of that reciprocal audit. She smiled. And of course, the space whales are interested in expanding their educational outreach program. Admiral Krex looked alarmed. Educational outreach? Sandra nodded. Oh, yes. They're very passionate about sharing knowledge. They've already started working with a few species on developing alternative propulsion methods, new applications of quantum mechanics. They just give this knowledge away. Krex interrupted. Sandra shrugged. They don't see the point of keeping it to themselves. Oresvier processed this information. So, the humans aren't just playing intergalactic mind games. You're helping them. Sandra chuckled. Oh, Oresvier. The whales don't need our help. We just like making sure the paperwork is in order. Blorg slumped forward, fully defeated. I can't believe we lost the paperwork. Krex sighed. It was inevitable. And so, the greatest bureaucratic battle in galactic history came to an end, not with a war, not with conquest, but with a simple, undeniable truth. The humans had won. They had done so through legal loopholes, passive-aggressive diplomacy, and the sheer, terrifying force of rules lawyering their way to dominance. The United Council of Civilized Planets was no longer just a governing body. It was, for all intents and purposes, a support group for those who had been outmaneuvered by humanity. And the worst part? Humanity had done it all without breaking a single rule. As Sandra Wu cheerfully left the council chamber, she glanced at Gregory Hill, who had been quietly listening to everything. So, she said, what's next? Gregory smiled. Oh, he said. I think we'll just see what happens. And somewhere, far beyond the reaches of known space, a space whale executed a perfect backflip into a wormhole, leaving behind a mathematical proof that would change the course of history. The humans, as always, sipped their tea, smiled, and watched the galaxy figure it out.